Sudan is in crisis. The two men who have been basically running the country for the past few years are now at war with each other, and it's tearing the country apart. The streets of Sudan's biggest cities have become battlegrounds. Schools, hospitals, and the country's main airport have been bombed.
We would wake up every morning to the sounds of bullets and missiles.
Our house was hit by a missile, and the missile didn't go off. It just went through the roof.
People have been shot in their homes. Kids have had to take shelter in the basements of schools where, they've been shot when they venture out.
You've just got large numbers of people trapped, so they haven't got access to electricity, and they're terrified of running out of food, of water.
You're hearing gunshots, you're hearing these missiles.
More than 250,000 people have fled the country, and more than 1 million have been forced from their homes.
Militia entered my house. They killed my husband and wounded my son. I was also tortured.
My 2 daughters saw everything. She still screams at night and cries out to me. Why are these people coming to kill us?
World leaders are scrambling to help both sides negotiate an end to this conflict, which has created a humanitarian disaster and is threatening to destabilise the entire region. Understanding what's actually going on here can be a bit complicated, so before we get started, there are 2 main things to keep in mind. This is more than just a fight between 2 men, and a lot of people don't believe the reasoning given by either of these men as to why they're fighting. To properly get to the bottom of this, I'm going to split this video up into 4 sections. The first 2 are going to be about who these men are and what they say about why this fighting is happening. The 3rd and 4th part are all about the bigger picture here and why so many people don't trust either of these men. To kick things off, let's start with who these men are and how they went from being the leader and deputy of Sudan to plunging the country into chaos. The first thing you've probably noticed is that these leaders don't look like politicians. Abdel Fattah al-Burhan and Mohamed Hamdan Dagalo, more commonly known as Hemedti, are military generals. And that's because Sudan isn't a democracy. It's one of the few countries in the world that has a military government. What makes Sudan even more unique is the fact that there isn't just one major military force in the country, and that's actually part of the problem here. Burhan is the general of Sudan's regular army, the Sudanese Armed Forces, while Hemedti is the commander of a completely separate and independently run militia known as the RSF. And the fighting happening right now is between these 2 groups. So, why are these 2 men fighting? There's a key bit of context here that's important to properly answer this question, and that's the fact that there isn't just one fight going on in Sudan right now. There are actually 2. The first, of course, is the fight that's happening on the surface between the 2 generals. The second is a struggle that the people of Sudan have been fighting for years, and one that will likely still be here when this war ends, and that is the fight for democracy. Now, if you ask either of the generals why they're fighting, they'll both say that the other is to blame for starting the violence, and that they're the one that's trying to protect the future of democracy in Sudan. So, who's telling the truth? This is where things start to get a little bit murky. A number of experts and a lot of people involved in the pro-democracy movement in Sudan don't really believe either of these men.
Neither of them have clean hands. Their history speaks for itself.
Both sides have trampled international humanitarian law.
This is a fight over power. Both sides would like to rule Sudan.
There are 2 main reasons why a lot of people don't really trust either of these generals and think that the recent fighting is just a power grab. The first is what the generals have done in the past, and the second is the fact that both generals have a lot to lose if Sudan does end up swapping its military government for a civilian-led democracy. Let's start with the past first. Sudan has a long history of military control and dictatorship that both Burhan and Hemedti have helped to protect. Since gaining independence, Sudan has spent close to 60 of the following 67 years under various forms of military control. Sudan's longest-serving leader during this period, and one of Africa's longest-serving dictators, was Omar al-Bashir. Both Burhan and Hemedti rose to power under Bashir and fought to protect his regime. Burhan with Sudan's army, while Hemedti was one of the leaders of the Janjaweed, a notorious group of Arab militias employed by Bashir to brutally crush his opponents. Bashir then formed the RSF as a more organised offshoot of the Janjaweed in 2013 and installed Hemedti as its commander. This is why Sudan now has two major military forces, something that's actually pretty common under dictatorships, as it prevents one single group from becoming too much of a threat to a dictator's authority. In 2018, after 3 decades of Bashir's rule, pro-democracy protests took off around the country. The thing is, Burhan and Hemedti actually sided with the protesters, teaming up to arrest and remove Bashir from power. This may sound pretty pro-democracy, but a lot of what happened after this is a big reason why many people in Sudan simply don't trust the generals to this day. After removing Bashir, the generals refused to hand over power to civilian leaders, instead deciding to appoint themselves as the head and deputy of a new military government. So, protesting continued.
We have no trust in the military council. Everyone that is sitting here agrees that Burhan is dirty. Hemedti thinks that the people here are scared of him.
How can we trust you? Because I have been betrayed and destroyed for 30 years.
We are standing here all the nights. We're going to stay here until the government is going to fall. We will never leave this place. We will shout it out together.
A big part of this continued protesting was a peaceful sit-in protest camped outside the military's headquarters in Sudan's capital. On June 3rd, military forces decided to break up this sit-in and ended up killing more than 100 protesters in what became known as the Khartoum Massacre.
Why did we have the revolution? To have a civilian government. The military took over the revolution and the blood of the martyrs was wasted.
This led to intense pressure from both inside and outside of Sudan, eventually forcing the generals to compromise to a power-sharing agreement with civilians. But even then, they still held on to Sudan's highest positions of power as the head and deputy of the country's sovereign council. The generals were originally supposed to hand over these positions to civilian leaders in 2021, but that never ended up happening. What the people of Sudan got instead in 2021 was a military coup, led by the generals who seized full control of the country and removed the little power civilian leaders had gained, which is how things largely remained until this recent fighting. Both generals justified all of this by saying they were protecting the country from infighting and instability. But experts say it shows they were likely never in support of democracy and were willing to do whatever it took to hold on to power.
The military, of course, we now know clearly, and most knew at the time, was never intent of giving power to a civilian government. We can see that clearly because when the American envoy goes a day before October 25th and says you need to hand over power to a civilian government, Burhan wages the coup the next day.
Now, whether or not you believe the generals about their motivations in the past, one thing that's hard to deny is that they both have a lot to lose if Sudan does transition to civilian government, something that started to look a lot more likely by the end of 2022. Mounting pressure had once again forced the generals back into talks with civilian leaders, and by December, they'd agreed to finally start Sudan's transition to democracy. However, when it came time to sort out the details, both Burhan and Hemedti couldn't come to an agreement. And after repeated failed negotiations, fighting between the two began. So, what exactly are civilian leaders demanding? And what do the generals actually stand to lose? The first thing is a loss of power and autonomy. Civilian leaders want the RSF to be folded into Sudan's military, and for the military to come under the control of a civilian government, as is the case in most countries. The second thing is a loss of economic power. Civilian leaders are keen to get Sudan's wealth back into the hands of civilians, as right now, both military groups control huge chunks of Sudan's economy. But even beyond money and power, there's also a genuine fear of losing freedom, something they've already seen happen to their old boss. During that brief window of civilian-military power sharing, the government agreed to hand over Bashir to the International Criminal Court to stand trial for war crimes he'd been accused of committing during his dictatorship. Both Burhan and Hemedti have also been accused of having ties to atrocities, not only for the massacre of protesters in 2019, but also for their involvement fighting in wars under Bashir, in particular the brutal war in Darfur in the mid-2000s.
I concluded that genocide has been committed in Darfur and that the government of Sudan and the Janjaweed bear responsibility.
You'd have aerial bombardments of Darfur that the military would engage in, executed by Burhan, and then the militias of Hemedti then would enact scorched earth policies, which would mean burning villages, sexual assault too.
They bombed from the sky. Then the soldiers and the Janjaweed came to our village.
When the Janjaweed come, you have two choices. You can run away or die.
That being said, Hemedti and the RSF, especially with its historical ties to the Janjaweed, do have more of a reputation when it comes to accusations of brutality and committing atrocities, which is partly why there are many people inside Sudan that would still prefer to see the army defeat the RSF. But, and this is important, that doesn't mean that they want Burhan to lead the country once this war ends. At the end of the day, even if you're willing to give these generals the benefit of the doubt about what they've done in the past, and believe that they're willing to lose their economic and political power, and potentially even their freedom, the bottom line here is that it doesn't really change anything for a lot of people in Sudan, who simply don't want to see either of these men anywhere near a future civilian government.
Protesters, they are looking for a new Sudan.
Yeah, we need to rebuild our country from scratch, basically. And we have no other option, we have no other choice.
We want a purely civilian government.
Civilian democratic rule is the only way for the country to advance.
The military needs to return to the barracks, and the rapid support forces need to be disbanded.
All people agreed on one main goal, that Sudan can't be ruled by the military.
All of this is why, no matter how the fight between these two men ends, supporters of civilian government in Sudan believe that their fight for democracy will continue.